What if I told you that the man you hate the most might be exactly the one you're meant to love? Amber was an internationally acclaimed ballerina determined to protect her historic theater. George was the cold, calculating businessman who bought the building to modernize it. Their first meeting was a declaration of war. No one imagined that a misunderstood contract would force them to fake a symbolic wedding in front of hundreds of people. But when the act became real on stage, everything changed. This is the story of how two enemies discovered that sometimes destiny doesn't just schedule a wedding, it binds two souls. Before we begin, subscribe to Paths of Romance, ring the bell so you never miss another heart-stealing story, hit the like button to support our work, and don't forget to hype this video, the new YouTube feature that helps stories like this reach more hearts around the world. Your support makes all the difference. Now, let's begin. George woke up every day at 5:45 in the morning, not out of military discipline, but out of calculated impatience. The world began moving at 6, and he liked to be 3 steps ahead, always. His apartment in downtown Chicago was as meticulous as an Excel spreadsheet. Straight lines, neutral tones, nothing out of place. The high-floor windows revealed a city still half asleep, wrapped in morning mist and blinking lights that shimmered like promises of business yet to be made. He brewed coffee in an Italian machine that cost more than most people's monthly salary, but, according to him, delivered consistency. George didn't tolerate variation, not in coffee, not in life. He dressed with the precision of a man who chose ties the way others chose strategies. Sober colors, impeccable cuts, not a single wrinkle. At 43, he was the kind of man who commanded a boardroom with a glance and signed contracts like finishing chess matches, always 5 moves ahead. That morning, however, something broke the routine. On the glass table beside his tablet, where financial reports awaited review, lay a thick envelope embossed with the golden crest of a law firm. Inside it, the deed to a theater. Not just any theater. The Ashford Hall, a historic building from decades past with an Italian stage, velvet balconies, and a reputation balancing between nostalgic romance and structural neglect. George didn't care for romance. He cared for prime locations, growth potential, and the opportunity to turn things into profit. A modern cultural center, perhaps, or a sleek commercial gallery. He hadn't decided yet. What mattered was that the building was his now, another asset in the portfolio, another project to optimize. He took a sip of coffee, his eyes scanning the clauses of the contract. Everything seemed in order, until a line near the end of page 3 made him frown. Commitment to cultural use for a minimum period of 12 months, in accordance with prior agreement with the resident company. George read it again, then again. Resident company? No one had mentioned that. He grabbed his phone and called the lawyer in charge, his voice controlled but sharp as a blade. "You're going to explain to me what resident company means in a full property acquisition contract." On the other end, the answer came hesitant, tangled in technical justifications and clauses inherited from previous administrations. George hung up. Before the man could finish, he didn't need excuses. He needed solutions. And more importantly, he needed to know who this resident company was that apparently came with the building like an unwanted bonus. 8,000 kilometers away, in a rehearsal studio in Berlin, Amber adjusted her headband for the 3rd time that hour. Not because it was crooked, but because she needed something to do with her hands while listening to the company's director explain, for the 4th time, why. The European tour would be shortened. Sponsorship issues, they said. Changes in the theater schedules, they claimed. Amber was fluent in corporate euphemism. Someone backed out, someone didn't pay, and now she had to return to the United States sooner than planned. She thanked him with a smile that never reached her eyes, grabbed her bag and left the studio before anyone could notice the irritation simmering beneath her polished exterior. At 39, Amber was the kind of woman who entered a room and quietly rearranged the gravity around her, not because of height, though she had the long, elegant frame of a classical ballerina, but because of presence. She moved as if every step were choreographed, even when merely crossing the street. Dark brown hair pulled into a perfect bun, posture upright, gaze assessing the world and finding it slightly below expectations. Amber wasn't arrogant. She was demanding, mostly of herself. She had spent 25 years on stage under spotlights that forgave neither a misplaced muscle nor a single uneven breath. Her body was her instrument, her tool, her language, and also her armor. While dancing, nothing could touch her. Not criticism, not disappointment, not the creeping fear that one day, perhaps soon, her body might no longer obey with the same precision. She walked through the streets of Berlin to a cafe she knew well, ordered a double espresso, and opened her laptop. 3 unread emails from Lillian, her agent and best friend, each more insistent than the last. The final one read simply, "Call me now." Amber smirked. Lillian had the gift of turning any subject into a dramatic emergency, but she was also the only person in the world Amber trusted without hesitation. She dialed. Lillian answered on the first ring. "Finally. I thought you'd been kidnapped by German mimes." "Mimes don't kidnap people, Lillian. They just stand there staring at you until you give up on life." "Perfect. You're in a good mood then. Because I have news that's going to change everything." Amber sighed. Lillian had a rare talent for delivering life-changing news that usually only changed the logistics of the following week. "Go ahead. The Ashford's been sold." Amber's stomach tightened. The Ashford Hall, the theater where she had started dancing at 14, where she had given her first professional performance, where she had cried from exhaustion and joy more times than she could count. The same theater that was about to welcome her back for a special tour, a triumphant return to the city where it had all begun. Sold to whom? Some businessman, George Williams, supposedly an investor in culture according to his website. But from what I dug up, the guy invests in anything with a profit margin. Art, tech, real estate. He buys, reshapes, and sells. A shark in a suit. And the tour contract? Still valid. Technically, you still have usage rights to the venue for the next 12 months, but what? But he's already making plans for modernization. And from what I've heard, modernization is just code for, let's put a gourmet coffee shop where the historic dressing rooms used to be. Amber closed her eyes, took a deep breath, counted to 5, then to 10. It didn't help. The anger rose like a wave, hot, unstoppable, inevitable. "When do I arrive?" 2 days. But Amber, try not to explode, okay? The guy's powerful, and you need that space. "I'm not going to explode, Lillian. You're using the tone that means you're going to explode. I'm using the tone that means I'm going to have a civilized, assertive conversation with the new owner." "Right. I'll reserve a front row seat to watch the disaster." Amber hung up, finished her coffee in one swallow, and looked out the window. Berlin remained beautiful, indifferent, full of people moving through their lives as if the world hadn't just shifted on its axis. But for her, something had. The Ashford wasn't just a theater. It was where she had discovered who she was. And now some stranger in a tailored suit and a spreadsheet was deciding its fate like it was just another number on a balance sheet. Amber wasn't the type to take that quietly. George was in his office when Brandon walked in without knocking. As always, Brandon was a minority partner in the company, but more importantly, the only person George truly considered a friend. They'd known each other since college, built their first business together, and survived 3 economic crises and 2 divorces. Brandon's, to be precise. George had never married. He had never seen the point. "So, you bought a theater, huh?" Brandon said, dropping into the leather chair across the desk. "Are we patrons of the arts now?" "We're investing in historical property with guaranteed appreciation," George corrected, eyes still on his screen. "The land alone is worth twice what I paid." "And the ballerina?" George finally looked up. "What ballerina?" Brandon grinned. That wide, infuriating grin of someone who knows something you don't. "The ballerina that comes with the theater. Amber Beyer. International name. European tours, awards, interviews. And from what I hear, a temper that makes a hurricane look like a spring breeze." George felt a flicker of irritation. He hated being caught off guard. "I'm aware there's a usage contract. I'll handle it." "Resolve it how?" "She has a legal right to use the space for the next 12 months. And honestly, you don't want to pick a public fight with her. The woman's practically a celebrity. If she badmouths you on social media, your theater becomes a public relations case study on how not to handle art." George leaned back in his chair, fingers drumming on the desk. Brandon was right. He hated when Brandon was right. "So, what do you suggest?" "Talk to her. Be diplomatic. Or I don't know, maybe try being nice." George rolled his eyes. I am nice. You're efficient. Polite when it's convenient. But nice? George, you have the charm of a rental contract, which is exactly why I close deals while you spend your day making jokes. Brandon laughed, getting up. I'm just saying this ballerina isn't a spreadsheet problem. She's a human one, and you're terrible with human problems. When Brandon left, George sat alone in his office, staring at the printed photo of the theater. The Ashford Hall really was beautiful, he had to admit that. But beauty didn't pay taxes, and temperamental ballerinas didn't fit into construction schedules. He sighed, saved the file, and shut down his computer. Tomorrow, he told himself, he would handle it. Like he handled everything else, with logic, clarity, and as little drama as possible. What George didn't know, what he could never have imagined, was that Amber, at that very moment, was on a transatlantic flight, planning the exact opposite, and their first meeting would be anything but logical. George arrived at Ashford Hall on a gray afternoon, one of those days when Chicago couldn't decide whether to rain or simply threaten to for hours on end. The building was even more imposing in person than in the photographs. A stone facade, Art Deco details, and double mahogany doors that creaked with decades of history. He paused on the sidewalk, taking it in. There was something majestic about it, he had to admit. But majesty didn't pay for roof repairs or electrical upgrades. Inside, the lobby smelled of aged wood and something indefinable that only historic buildings possess. A blend of time, noble dust, and memories no one had asked to keep. George walked to the center, his footsteps echoing on the worn marble floor. The walls still bore gilded frames with black and white photographs, ballerinas in ethereal poses, audiences in tuxedos and long gowns, from a time when going to the theater was an event, not just entertainment. He pulled his phone from his pocket, making mental notes. The lobby could be turned into a modern lounge. The stairs, with their wrought iron railings, deserved restoration, though nothing that justified the architect's inflated budget. And that central chandelier, massive, tilted to one side, definitely needed to be replaced with something more functional. Take your hands off my chandelier, the voice came from above, sharp and commanding as a dissonant chord. George looked up and saw her. Amber stood at the top of the staircase, one hand on the railing, the other on her hip, striking a pose that balanced between silent film diva and general about to invade enemy territory. She wore tailored black pants, a white silk blouse, and an expression that made it clear she wasn't there for polite greetings. Her hair was loose, cascading in soft waves around her shoulders, framing a face that blended classic beauty with something far more dangerous, determination. George blinked, regaining composure. I wasn't touching anything. You were looking at the chandelier with that face of yours, the one that calculates how much it would cost to replace it with some boring LED fixture. She descended the stairs, each step measured, controlled, and the answer is, you're not replacing it. That chandelier has more history than you have shares in the stock market. George crossed his arms, studying her. So this was her, the temperamental ballerina, the human problem Brandon had mentioned. He took a deep breath, activating what passed for his diplomatic mode. You must be Amber Beyer, and you must be the man who bought my theater thinking you could turn it into a giant Starbucks. Our theater, technically, he corrected, voice calm but firm. It's mine, legally speaking. You have a usage contract. There's a difference. Technically, she repeated, stepping off the last stair and stopping just a few feet away. You bought a building without reading the fine print, and now you're stuck with me for 12 months. Must be terrible being you. A muscle in George's jaw twitched. He wasn't used to being challenged like this. Most people avoided confronting him directly, preferring polite detours and carefully worded emails. But there she was, standing right in front of him like she owned the place. And thanks to that cursed contract, for the next year, she practically did. Look, he said, keeping his tone professional, I understand that you have an emotional connection to this place, and I respect that. But emotion doesn't keep a building standing. This theater is falling apart. It needs structural repairs, modernization, and yes, a business model that makes it sustainable. It's not personal. It's logic. Amber tilted her head slightly, as if observing a particularly disappointing piece of art. Logic, of course. Because everything in life boils down to numbers and efficiency, doesn't it? Must be a very empty way to see the world. And seeing the world through choreography and metaphors must be very practical when it's time to pay the bills. I pay my bills just fine, she shot back, her voice sharpening like glass. Unlike some people, I don't need to demolish history to do it. I'm not demolishing anything. I'm modernizing, restoring, making this place viable for the next 50 years, not just the 50 that have already passed. Modernizing, she repeated with barely disguised contempt. Is that what you people call it when you rip the soul out of a place and replace it with glass and steel? It's what we call it when we want a place to survive, instead of becoming a romantic ruin for nostalgic people who think dust is charm. Amber's eyes flashed. She took a step forward, invading his personal space with the kind of boldness that came from not fearing confrontation. Do you know what your problem is? You look at this theater and see nothing but bricks and wood, square footage, profit potential, return on investment. You don't see the people who passed through here, the stories, the dreams that were born on this stage. And do you know what your problem is? George didn't step back, holding her gaze with equal force. You're so obsessed with the past that you can't see that without change. There's no future. This building will collapse on top of your nostalgia if someone doesn't do something practical about it. Then do it, she challenged, her voice low but charged with defiance. But do it without destroying what matters. If you're capable, I'll do it my way, with or without your approval. Perfect, and I'll be here every day making sure you don't turn this place into another soulless project. Wonderful. It's going to be a very entertaining year. It's going to be hell. On that, George gave a cold, polite, purely professional smile. We finally agree. They stood there for a few more seconds, neither willing to back down. Then Amber turned sharply, her hair sweeping through the air as she climbed the stairs again, her firm footsteps echoing through the empty hall. George stayed where he was, breathing deeply, trying to regain his composure. That woman was impossible. Stubborn, dramatic, completely irrational. He would have to find a way around her, make her understand that his renovations were necessary, that he wasn't the villain in this story. But as he walked back to his car, a small, irritating corner of his mind registered one inconvenient fact. Amber Beyer was the first person in years who hadn't been intimidated by him, and absurd as it was, that was almost interesting. Almost. The following week set the tone for what their coexistence would become, a Cold War punctuated by open battles. George showed up every morning, punctual as a Swiss clock, always accompanied by someone, an architect, an engineer, an interior designer, an acoustics consultant. He inspected every corner of the theater with clinical precision, taking notes, photos, and speaking in low tones that Amber inevitably overheard, and challenged out loud. That wall can't be taken down, she said one morning when the architect suggested opening up the space between the lobby and what used to be the ticket booth. It's, non-structural, George replied, not even bothering to look at her. It can. It can't, because behind it there's a tile panel from 1926. If you tear that down, you'll be destroying historical heritage. The architect looked at George, who sighed with visibly thinning patience. Fine, we'll leave the wall. For now. Not for now. Amber crossed her arms. Forever. Nothing lasts forever. He finally turned toward her, his expression neutral but his tone, making clear his patience had an expiration date, especially in real estate. What a comforting philosophy. Must be a hit at funerals. Brandon, who had started tagging along to the theater visits under the pretext of overseeing the investment, barely managed to contain his laughter. George shot him a warning look, but Brandon only shrugged, clearly entertained. The arguments were daily. Amber challenged every decision, every blueprint, every suggestion. George, in turn, countered, with reports, technical assessments, and an artificial patience that made it obvious he was counting the days until her contract expired. You do this on purpose, don't you? He said one afternoon, after she'd spent 20 minutes arguing over the choice of chairs for the audience. Do what? Complicate everything, turn every simple decision into an epic battle. I don't complicate things, she replied, her voice too sweet to be sincere. I just make sure you don't make stupid decisions. My decisions are based on studies, data, and technical analyses, and mine are based on knowing this place better than you ever will. Experience counts, you know. Or do you think everything can be solved with a spreadsheet? Spreadsheets, he said, his voice low and dangerously calm. Keep businesses running. Emotion only creates debt. And what about soul? Where does soul fit into your equation? Soul doesn't pay suppliers. Amber rolled her eyes and left the room, leaving George alone with Brandon, who was watching everything with an infuriating grin. Admit it, Brandon said. You're enjoying this. Enjoying what? Having every decision questioned by a dramatic artist who thinks old wood is a sacred relic? Having someone who challenges you? You've been bored for years, George. Everything's too easy. Everyone agrees with you. Everyone says, "Yes, sir. Great idea, sir." She doesn't. She looks you in the eye and tells you you're wrong. She is wrong. Maybe. Or maybe you're both wrong and right at the same time. George didn't reply, because deep down he knew Brandon had a point, but admitting that would mean admitting that Amber was right about something, and he wasn't ready for that. Not yet. By the end of the week, Lillian showed up at the theater carrying coffee and sandwiches for Amber, who had spent the entire afternoon going through old theater contracts to find clauses that could protect specific parts of the building. "You're obsessed," Lillian said, sitting beside her in the empty auditorium. "I'm protecting my workspace. You're fighting a personal war with a man who, let's be honest, isn't exactly unattractive." Amber looked up from the document, incredulous. "Are you serious? I'm saying you've spent more time thinking about him than about any man in the last 5 years. I'm thinking about how to stop him from destroying this theater. You're thinking about him. There's a difference. Lillian, he's arrogant, insensitive, pragmatic to the bone, and has the emotional depth of a sheet of paper. He's also smart, successful, has excellent taste in suits, and, based on what I've seen, doesn't look away when you confront him. Men like that are rare. Men like that are nightmares. Or challenges." Lillian smiled. "And you love challenges." Amber didn't answer because, at that exact moment, George entered the auditorium from the side, a corridor, accompanied by a man she recognized instantly. Lorenzo Lane, a cultural journalist for one of the city's most influential magazines. George stopped when he saw them, but it was Lorenzo who spoke first, wearing a friendly smile. "Amber Beyer. What an honor. I've been waiting to meet you in person." Amber stood up, instinctively switching to professional mode. Polite smile, perfect posture, warmth carefully controlled. "Lorenzo, right? I've read your column. And I saw. You dance in Paris 2 years ago. Unforgettable." He turned to George. "You two need to talk. I have a proposal that will interest both of you." George and Amber exchanged quick glances, his suspicious, hers cautious. "What kind of proposal?" George asked. Lorenzo opened the folder he was carrying and pulled out a few printed pages. "My magazine wants to do a cover story on the reopening of Ashford Hall, the union between tradition and modernity, art and business. And you two," he gestured between George and Amber, "are the perfect embodiment of that union." "There is no union," Amber said a little too quickly. "There's a contract," George corrected, his tone neutral. "Exactly." Lorenzo smiled as if they'd confirmed precisely what he wanted to hear. "Creative tension. It sells. We want to document the process. Interviews, photos, following the decision step by step. It'll be fantastic." "No," George and Amber said at the same time. Lorenzo blinked, surprised. "You haven't even heard the details." "I don't need to," George said. "I'm not interested in making my work process public. And I'm not interested in being on a magazine cover next to him," Amber added, pointing at George as if he were an inconvenient piece of furniture. Lorenzo looked from one to the other, then smiled. A slow, almost dangerous smile. "I see. So you're not interested in the 3 sponsors who've already agreed to invest in the theater, if this feature goes forward. Nor in the contacts I could arrange to expand her tour," he looked at Amber, "nor in the national visibility this would bring to his project." He turned to George. "Fine. I'll find another theater. There are plenty in Chicago." He began gathering his papers. George and Amber exchanged glances again, but this time there was more than hostility in the air. There was calculation. "How long would the coverage last?" George asked. 3 months, culminating in a feature piece for the official reopening. "And what exactly do you plan to document?" Amber asked, her voice wary. "The creative process, the decisions, the dynamic between you, how art and business can coexist." Lorenzo paused. "We want to show that it's possible to preserve and innovate at the same time, and you two are living proof of that." "We're not," Amber said flatly. "Not yet," Lorenzo corrected. "But you could be, if you choose to." Silence. George looked at Amber. Amber looked at George. Neither wanted to give in, but both knew that saying no meant losing opportunities that didn't come twice. "I'll need to talk to my team," George said. "And I'll need to talk to my agent," Amber added. Lorenzo smiled. "Perfect. I'll come back next week. And just for the record," he glanced at both of them, a mischievous sparkle in his eyes, "you do realize that's the second thing you've agreed on today, right?" Then he left, leaving George and Amber alone in the empty auditorium, both quietly and increasingly irritated by one undeniable truth. He was right. They had agreed. And somehow, that felt far more dangerous than any argument could ever be. Amber spent the next 3 days trying to convince herself that accepting Lorenzo's proposal was a terrible idea. Lillian, meanwhile, spent the same 3 days trying to convince her of the opposite. 3 sponsors, Amber. 3. Do you have any idea what that means for the tour? For the theater? Lillian sat on Amber's couch, laptop open, already running numbers and projections. "It means 3 months being followed by a team of journalists while pretending I don't want to strangle the owner of the theater," Amber replied, adjusting her leg on the stretching bar she'd installed in her living room. "You're not going to strangle anyone. You're going to be professional, charming, and use this to make sure Ashford is preserved. Exactly the way you want. It's strategy, not surrender." Amber stopped stretching and looked at her friend. "Do you honestly think I can spend 3 months working side by side with that man without one of us ending up in jail for homicide? I think you've already been working side by side with him for a week, and both of you are still alive. Irritated, but alive." Lillian closed her laptop. "Look, I get it. He's everything you hate. Cold, calculating, obsessed with numbers. But he's also the owner of the theater. And whether you like it or not, you two need to find middle ground. This feature could be the bridge. Or it could be the circus. Circuses sell tickets." Lillian smiled. "And let's be honest, you two together have enough dramatic potential for a Netflix series." Amber rolled her eyes but couldn't hide a faint smile. Lillian had the infuriating habit of being right most of the time. "I'll think about it. Think fast." Lorenzo's coming back in. 4 days. Across town, George was having the same conversation, male edition, with Brandon. "It's good publicity," Brandon said, flipping through the portfolio of the magazine Lorenzo had left behind. "National exposure, cultural credibility, the image of a businessman who cares about historical heritage. You can't buy that kind of press." "I don't need press. I need results," George said, standing in front of his office window, hands in his pockets, face set in stone. "Results include public perception. And right now, public perception says you're the villain who bought a historic theater to turn it into something bland and profitable. I'm not a villain. I'm saving the building from bankruptcy. I know that. You know that. But no one else does. And guess who's controlling the narrative? She is." Brandon pointed at the tablet, where a recent article from a cultural blog mentioned tensions between the new owner and the resident company of Ashford Hall. "Beyer has name recognition, followers, artistic credibility. If she badmouths you publicly, you'll become the soulless businessman trying to destroy art. But if you two appear together, showing it's possible to balance preservation and modernization, I become the hero," George said, skeptical. "You become human, which, frankly, would already be an upgrade from your current public image." George turned, irritation flickering in his eyes. "I don't care about public image." "You should, because public image affects investors, partnerships, everything. And that temperamental ballerina you despise so much has more power to ruin your reputation than you think." George was silent for a long moment, processing. He hated to admit it, but Brandon was right. Refusing the feature meant losing control of the narrative. Accepting it meant having to coexist with Amber in a closer, more visible, more complicated way. "She'll never agree to it," he finally, said. "She will. Because she's smart. And because when it comes down to it, you both want the same thing, for the theater to survive. You just disagree on the method. George sighed, turning back toward the window. Chicago stretched out beyond the glass, indifferent to his personal dilemmas. 3 months, he murmured. 3 months pretending we can tolerate each other. Who knows? Brandon grinned. You might even surprise yourselves. The following week, Lorenzo returned to the theater with a more detailed proposal, contracts, and a small team of photographers and producers. George and Amber were waiting, each on one side of the lobby, like generals from opposing armies before a peace negotiation. So? Lorenzo asked, his optimism bordering on irritating. Have you reached a decision? George looked at Amber. Amber looked at George. Neither wanted to be the first to yield. I'll accept, George said, his tone firm. With conditions. So will I, said Amber almost at the same time. And I have conditions too. Lorenzo smiled, pulling a notepad from his pocket. I'm listening. George crossed his arms. No interference with the renovation schedule. The feature can document, but it cannot delay the project. Agreed, Amber said, surprising everyone, including herself. But there will be no unilateral decisions about historical areas of the theater. Any structural changes to original spaces require my approval. George turned to her, incredulous. Your approval? You don't have legal authority for that. I have contractual authority and moral authority. And if you want this feature to happen without me spending 3 months telling the press what a corporate tyrant you are, I suggest you accept. Lorenzo watched them both like someone following a tennis match. So, you'll make decisions together? We'll discuss together, George corrected. Working together implies agreement. That's unlikely. Impossible, Amber added. Perfect. Lorenzo clapped his hands, genuinely delighted. Creative tension is exactly what we want. Now, about the feature's dynamic. We'll need photo sessions, individual and joint interviews, documentation of meetings, and a launch event. What kind of event? Amber asked, suspicious. Lorenzo smiled, and there was something dangerously playful about it. A project launch cocktail. You two as hosts. Sponsors, press, public. Figures? We need to show that Ashford Hall is being reborn under a solid partnership. We're not partners, George stated flatly. But you'll pretend to be, Lorenzo replied with brutal simplicity. For 3 months. That's the deal. Amber and George exchanged a long look, filled with mutual resistance and strategic calculation. Neither liked it, but both knew it was the smartest move on the board. Fine, Amber said finally. I'll pretend. So will I, George replied. But let's be clear, this is strictly professional. Of course, Lorenzo smiled, tucking the notepad away. Strictly professional. Now we'll start with a photo session next week. Something natural. The two of you talking, maybe on stage or backstage. No, said George and Amber in unison. Lorenzo sighed. You two really have to stop agreeing like that. It ruins the image of conflict I'm trying to sell to my readers. The next 2 weeks were a strange mix of routine and chaos. The renovation moved forward, slowly because every decision turned into a debate. Lorenzo's team showed up unannounced, cameras in hand, capturing spontaneous moments that were anything but spontaneous. And George and Amber developed a sort of hostile choreography. They argued, negotiated, reached minimal agreements, then retreated to their respective corners until the next round. Anise, Amber's younger sister, started frequenting the theater to help with the artistic side of the reopening, choreography, lighting, stage direction. She was younger, more irreverent, and had a natural talent for sarcasm. You two look like a couple fighting for child custody, she said one afternoon, watching George and Amber argue about the color of the stage curtains. We're not a couple, Amber said without taking her eyes off George. And there's no child, George added without taking his eyes off Amber. Just a theater you treat like one, Anise quipped. Same energy, Amber rolled her eyes. Don't you have work to do? I do, but watching you two is way more entertaining. Anise pointed at the fabric samples scattered across the table. Seriously, what's the difference between dark burgundy and imperial wine? It's the same color. It's not, George and Amber said together once again. Anise smiled, shaking her head. You two realize you agree on more things than you disagree on, right? We don't agree, Amber said firmly. We disagree on principle. said George. Not on details. Oh, right, just a philosophical incompatibility. Great. That's never caused trouble in a relationship before. It's not a relationship, Amber snapped, tossing the fabric samples back into the box. It's a contract. Of course, Anise said with a shrug as she headed out. A contract that requires you to spend every day together, make joint decisions, and pretend to like each other in public. Basically, a marriage. She disappeared before Amber could throw something at her. George, who had watched the whole exchange in silence, allowed himself a half smile. Your sister is direct. She's infuriating, Amber corrected. But she's not entirely wrong. George raised an eyebrow. About what? About this being way too complicated to be worth it. George was quiet for a moment, his fingers drumming lightly on the table. Are you thinking about quitting? I'm thinking, Amber said, meeting his gaze that maybe I overestimated my ability to work with someone so pragmatic, inflexible. Funny, he shot back with equal intensity. I was thinking the same about you. So passionate, stubborn. They stared at each other, the air between them charged with a tension that wasn't exactly hostile, but wasn't comfortable either. It was something undefined, irritating, impossible to ignore. You know what I think, Amber said finally, her voice lower now. I think we're both too stubborn to quit, so we'll keep doing this. We'll fake it for Lorenzo and the sponsors, and in the end we'll go our separate ways and pretend it never happened. Sounds like a reasonable plan, George agreed. Great. But neither of them moved. They just stood there facing each other, as if waiting for the other to say something more, something neither of them could name. Amber was the one who broke the silence. She grabbed her bag and turned to leave. See you at the photo shoot. See you, George replied, and she walked out, leaving him alone in the empty theater with the strange feeling that something had shifted in that conversation. Something small, almost imperceptible, but definitely there. The photo session was a carefully choreographed disaster. The photographer, a man named Derek with round glasses and excessive enthusiasm, wanted naturalness. The problem was, there was absolutely nothing natural about the way George and Amber interacted. Try standing a little closer, Derek said, adjusting his camera. They each took a mechanical step forward. Closer. Another step. Now they were less than half a meter apart. Amber could smell his cologne. Expensive, understated, a blend of wood and spice. George, in turn, noticed that she smelled floral and clean, like lavender or jasmine. Neither would ever admit they'd noticed. Now smile. Naturally, they smiled. They looked like two, politicians in an election debate. Okay, this isn't working, Derek sighed, lowering his camera. You need to relax. Pretend you like each other. We respect each other professionally, George said through gritted teeth. Lie, Amber muttered, just low enough that Derek couldn't hear, but loud enough for George to catch it. He turned to her, incredulous. Excuse me? You don't respect me. You tolerate me. There's a difference. I respect your persistence. Persistence, she repeated, acid in her tone. What a generous compliment. You're arguing again, Derek noted, but now he was smiling. That's it. Keep that energy. It's perfect. And he started taking pictures. George and Amber realized too late that they'd fallen into his trap. They tried to compose their expressions back into neutrality, but Derek already had what he wanted. Shots of two enemies locked in silent combat, challenging gazes, tense body language, the electric pull, a friction caught mid-air. Perfect, Derek said, putting his camera away. The magazine's going to love it. You two have incredible chemistry. Chemistry? George repeated, incredulous. Yes, Derek grinned. Antagonistic chemistry, but chemistry. It's the kind that grabs people's attention. They'll want to know how this story ends. He left, and George and Amber were once again alone on the stage, both processing what had just happened. He thinks we have chemistry, Amber said flatly. He clearly doesn't know what chemistry is, George replied. Clearly. Silence. But he's right about one thing, George said after a moment, turning to her, his expression serious. People will want to know how this ends. It ends with you renovating the theater your way, me finishing my tour, and us never seeing each other again. Exactly, he agreed. Great. Perfect. But for the first time since they'd met, Neither of them sounded entirely convinced. The launch cocktail was scheduled for a month from now. A month that, for George and Amber, somehow felt both too long and too short. Long, because it meant 30 days of forced coexistence, endless meetings, and interview sessions where they had to pretend to like each other. Short, because the list of pending decisions about the theater grew faster than they could resolve them. Their dynamic had found a strange rhythm, not exactly harmonious but functional. They argued, of course, every day. But the arguments had become almost ritualistic. George would present a proposal based on budget and practicality. Amber would counter with historical and aesthetic reasoning. They would debate for 20 minutes, and eventually arrive at a compromise that neither found ideal, but both could live with. It's like negotiating with a concrete wall that occasionally gives half a centimeter, Amber said to Lillian one afternoon when her agent came by to pick up signed contracts. And he probably says the same thing about you, Lillian replied, flipping through the papers. By the way, I saw the photos from the magazine preview. You two look like you're either fighting or flirting. Hard to tell. Fighting, Amber said quickly. Definitely fighting. Of course, Lillian smiled, that infuriating smile of someone who didn't believe a word they were hearing. That's why you spend half your time complaining about him and the other half dressing up more than usual before heading to the theater. I don't dress up more. Yesterday you changed clothes 3 times. I was undecided. You're never undecided about clothes. You're a ballerina. Your wardrobe is basically black, white, and shades of gray. Lillian leaned in, lowering her voice. Admit it. He gets under your skin in a different way. Amber was about to respond, but at that exact moment George walked into the dressing room she had turned into. A temporary office, knocking on the already open door purely out of formality. We need to talk about the event. Come in, make yourself comfortable, don't worry about waiting for a response, Amber murmured, though there wasn't much actual irritation in her tone. George ignored the sarcasm. He was used to it by now. Lorenzo wants us to give a joint speech. Something about shared vision, the future of the theater, the union of art and business. You write the artistic part. I'll write the technical one, then we'll merge them and rehearse. Amber crossed her arms. We'll sound like one of those political couples on a campaign tour. We'll sound professional, George corrected. Which is what we are. Lillian, watching the exchange with barely concealed amusement, stood up. I'll let you two handle that. I've got a meeting. She stopped beside George, lowering her voice just enough for Amber to hear. Take care of my friend. She's stubborn, but she breaks easily. And she left, leaving behind a faintly awkward silence. Your agent is direct, George said. She's irritating, Amber replied, echoing what she'd said about her sister weeks before. But efficient, like you. George blinked, caught off guard. Was that a compliment? It was an observation, Amber said, picking up her tablet. About the speech, I'll write my part tonight, you write yours, and we'll meet the day after tomorrow to merge them. That work for you works for me. He hesitated for a moment as if wanting to add something, but then simply nodded and left. Amber stood there for a few seconds, staring at the closed door, an odd feeling tightening in her chest. It wasn't anger. It wasn't frustration. It was something subtler, more unsettling, almost curiosity. She shook her head, dismissing the thought, and went back to work. 2 days later, they met in one of the theater's meeting rooms that George had turned into a temporary office. The table was covered in blueprints, reports, and 2 cups of coffee, a habit they'd developed without realizing it, each one bringing coffee for the other when they knew a meeting would run long. I started with the history, Amber said, opening the document on her tablet. Talked about the founding of the theater, the first companies, its cultural significance. I started with feasibility, George replied, turning his laptop so she could see. Investment, restoration, sustainable management model. They read each other's texts in silence. Amber frowned. Yours sounds like an annual corporate report. Yours sounds like a poetic elegy. George shot back. Because it's a theater, not a factory. It's a business, not a museum. They stared at each other for a long moment. Then Amber sighed. Fine, let's try again. I'll tone down the poetry. You tone down the corporate jargon, and we'll meet somewhere in the middle. George nodded. Fair enough. They spent the next 2 hours rewriting, trimming, adjusting. It was a surprisingly collaborative process. George suggested clearer phrasing. Amber suggested more evocative imagery. He agreed, she agreed, and slowly the text began to take shape. It wasn't his or hers anymore, it was theirs. Ashford Hall is reborn not in spite of its history, but because of it. Amber read aloud. That works. It's strong without being sentimental. And the part about necessary modernization turned out well too, George added. Less technical, more human. Amber looked at him with an odd expression. We just agreed. On several things. In a row. I noticed, he replied, something almost amused in his tone. Disturbing. Very, she said, smiling. A small, genuine smile. George looked away, back to the screen, but not quickly enough to hide the fact that he was smiling too. The news came a week before the event. A bomb neatly wrapped. In letterhead. Lorenzo showed up at the theater with the look of a man who had something important to say, but wasn't quite sure how. George and Amber were on stage, discussing lighting with a niece, when he called them aside for a private conversation. There's a problem, Lorenzo said the moment they were alone in the main dressing room. What kind of problem? George asked, instantly on alert. The kind that could either save the theater or ruin everything depending on how you handle it. Lorenzo took a deep breath. The sponsors loved the feature, loved you two, so much that they decided to increase their investment. That's good, Amber said, confused. Why do you look like you're about to deliver bad news? Because the investment comes with a condition. Lorenzo glanced between them. They want you to make the partnership official, publicly, in a symbolic way. Symbolic how? George's tone was already wary. Lorenzo hesitated. They want a wedding. Symbolic, of course, not legal, just a performative ceremony on reopening night as part of the event. Art and business officially united. It's marketing, it's theater, it's ridiculous, Amber interrupted, incredulous. They want us to fake a wedding. Not fake, exactly. Stage one as a performance piece, a metaphor for union. Lorenzo spoke quickly, defensively. Look, I know it sounds insane, but the investment they're offering would secure the theater's maintenance for the next 5 years. 5 years, you two. No more sustainability worries. George stood still, processing. Amber stood still, processing. Neither spoke. How long do we have to decide? George asked finally. 2 days. They want an answer before finalizing the contract. And if we refuse, they'll withdraw the offer and probably find another project to invest in. A heavy silence. I need to think, Amber said. Me too, George replied. Lorenzo nodded and left, leaving them alone. Amber sat down on one of the old dressing room chairs, her head in her hands. George remained standing, hands in his pockets, staring at the dusty mirror on the wall. This is insane, Amber said, her voice muffled. It is, George agreed. They want us to stage a wedding, like we're characters in a soap opera. I know. And the worst part? She lifted her head, meeting his gaze through the mirror, is that it'll work. The public will love it. The press will love it, and the theater will get the funding it needs. George turned to face her directly. You're considering saying yes. I'm considering not having a choice, she corrected. If we refuse, we lose the investment. If we lose the investment, the theater becomes vulnerable, and everything we fought to preserve could vanish in the next financial storm. And if we agree, George crossed his arms, we'll have to stage a fake wedding ceremony in front of hundreds of people pretending to have a bond that doesn't exist. We're already pretending. Amber stood up. We've pretended for the photos, for the journalists, for the interviews. This would just be another layer of pretending. A wedding isn't just another layer, he said, his tone strangely serious. Even symbolic, it's a public declaration. People will talk about it for months. Do you care what people say? George stayed quiet. The truth was, he didn't. He'd never cared. But something about this particular situation unsettled him in a way he couldn't quite name. I care, he said finally, about not lying when it isn't necessary. It's not a lie. It's theater. Amber stepped closer to him. You do know the difference, don't you? Between performance and fraud? I do, but not everyone else does. They stood there, only a few feet apart, their eyes locked in a silent exchange neither of them knew how to put into words. I'm going to say yes, Amber said at last. Because I need this theater to survive. And if that means pretending to get married for a few hours, then so be it. But you don't have to do it. If you want to refuse, I'll understand." George looked at her. Really looked. He saw the determination, but also the exhaustion. The strength, but also the vulnerability. And for the first time, he understood that Amber wasn't just fighting for a building. She was fighting for everything the theater meant. Her history, her identity, proof that her life had mattered. And somehow, in a strange, inconvenient way, he wanted her to win. "I'll do it," he said quietly, but with conviction. Amber blinked, surprised. "Seriously?" "Seriously, but with conditions." "What conditions?" "No staged kiss, no fake declarations of eternal love. We keep it formal, respectful, elegant, but free of romantic theatrics." Amber smiled, a small, tired smile. "No romantic theatrics." "Agreed." They shook hands, sealing the deal in the most formal and distant way possible. But when George's fingers brushed against hers, there was a moment, just one, when both of them felt something. A faint current of electricity, almost imperceptible, that neither was prepared for. They released their hands quickly, both looking away, both pretending nothing had happened. But something had, and they both knew it. The news leaked before they could control it. Not the details of the symbolic wedding. Those were still under contractual secrecy. But the rumor that George and Amber had intensified their partnership and that something special was being planned for the reopening event. The arts press went wild. Social media exploded. And suddenly, George and Amber were no longer just the businessman and the ballerina in a professional collaboration. They were a story, an unlikely couple, the embodiment of the opposites attract fantasy. "This is out of control," Brandon said, when he showed up at George's office with a stack of printed articles. "You two are trending. People are literally betting on whether you're dating for real." George rubbed his temples, feeling the beginning of a headache. "It's just marketing. People will forget once the event's over." "Do you really believe that?" Brandon sat down, his expression serious. "George, you're about to stage a wedding with a woman you've spent the past 2 months arguing with. People won't forget. They'll speculate. They'll make things up. They'll build a narrative that doesn't exist." George finished. "I know, and I accept the risk." Brandon was quiet for a moment. "You like her." George looked up, defensive. "Don't be ridiculous. You like her, maybe not romantically, but you respect her. You admire her, and for you, that's already a lot." "Brandon, I'm just saying maybe you should consider the possibility that this isn't just performance." Brandon stood. "Because from what I've seen, she respects you too. She challenges you. She makes you work harder than any business partner ever has. That means something. It means she's stubborn. It means she's like you." Brandon smiled. "And maybe that's exactly why it works." He left, leaving George alone with his thoughts and a pile of articles he didn't want to read, but knew he should. Across town, Amber was having the same conversation, the female version, with a niece. "You know everyone thinks you and the businessman are having an affair, right?" Anise said, sprawled on Amber's couch, scrolling through her phone with morbid fascination. "We're not," Amber replied automatically. "I know you're not, but the rest of the world doesn't. And honestly, the way you two argue looks a lot like people with unresolved sexual tension." "Anise, I'm just saying," she set her phone down. "You're going to marry him, even if it's fake. It's not a real wedding. It's an artistic performance. That's going to happen in front of hundreds of people, with you in white and him waiting at the altar." Anise sat up. "Amber, you do realize this is completely insane, right?" "I realize it, but it's necessary madness. And you don't feel anything, nothing at all, for the guy?" Amber stayed silent a bit too long. "I feel irritation, impatience, frustration, and curiosity," she admitted at last. "Sometimes I look at him and wonder what goes on in that head of his. How someone can be so intelligent and yet so emotionally blind at the same time. How he manages to be infuriating and impressive in the very same sentence." Anise grinned. "You're doomed." "I am not." "Oh, you are, because you just described attraction. That's not attraction. It's acknowledgement of complex characteristics." "Sis," Anise stood grabbing her bag, "you can call it whatever you want, but the day you walk down that fake Aisle with him waiting in a suit. I'll be in the front row watching you realize that maybe it's not so fake after all." And she left, leaving Amber alone with the uncomfortable feeling that her younger sister had just said something terribly, inconveniently true. Preparations for the reopening event had turned the theater into a human anthill. Florists debated arrangements, technicians adjusted lighting, catering teams tested menus, and in the middle of all that controlled chaos, George and Amber tried to stay sane while rehearsing a ceremony neither of them had ever asked to perform. "This is ridiculous," Amber muttered for the 10th time that morning, staring at the script Lorenzo had prepared. They were on stage, alone for the first time in days, taking advantage of a rare break between production teams. The space had been transformed. New burgundy curtains, the color they had finally agreed on after 3 heated arguments, hung elegantly from the restored arches. The chandelier, the one Amber had fought for since day one, gleamed like a freshly polished antique jewel. The wooden floor was spotless, golden reflections dancing under the test lights. "I agree," George said, also looking at the script. "But it's the ridiculous that got us this far. Let's just do what needs to be done." He looked tired. Amber noticed it in his slightly slouched shoulders, in the way he rubbed the back of his neck, a gesture that had become frequent in recent weeks. George had always seemed unshakable, a wall of efficiency and control. But here, under the soft glow of the empty theater, he looked simply human. "Are you sleeping?" she asked before she could stop herself. George looked up, surprised by the question. "Enough." "That means no," Amber translated. "You need rest. Having a nervous breakdown at a symbolic altar would be terrible for your image." He almost smiled. "Almost. Always pragmatic. I learned from the best," she replied, and there was something different in her tone. It wasn't sarcasm. It was almost a compliment. George studied her for a moment, as if trying to decode a new language. "You're tired too," he observed. "I saw you adjust the same choreography 5 times yesterday. You never need 5 attempts." Amber blinked, surprised that he had noticed. It was hard to sync with the new lighting. "Or you're exhausted and won't admit it. I always dance when I'm tired. Comes with the job. You don't have to, not here." George folded the script and slipped it into his pocket. "We can postpone the rehearsal if you want to rest." The unexpected kindness caught Amber off guard. She said nothing for a few seconds, just looked at him, trying to understand when this pragmatic, emotionally guarded man had started paying attention to things like her fatigue or her repeated choreography attempts. "No need to postpone," she finally said. "Let's just get it over with." George nodded, and they returned to the script. The symbolic ceremony would be simple, according to Lorenzo. They would enter from opposite sides of the stage, meet at the center, exchange short, neutral vows about the union between tradition and innovation, and then together unveil a commemorative plaque marking the reopening. No kiss, no physical contact beyond a handshake. Simple, clean, professional. But when they started rehearsing, they quickly discovered that even simplicity could be complicated. "You're walking too fast," Amber said as George crossed the stage in long, efficient strides. "I'm walking at a normal pace. Normal for you, maybe. You go through life at executive speed. This is a ceremony, not a board meeting. Slow down." George sighed but went back to his starting point and tried again. This time, his steps were slower, but the movement was stiff, mechanical. "Now you look like a robot," Amber observed. "Do you want slower or more natural? Decide. I want you to walk like you're actually in a wedding ceremony, not like you're heading to sign a contract. Technically, weddings are contracts." Amber rolled her eyes. "You're impossible, and you're a perfectionist." "I'm a ballerina. Perfection is the minimum standard." They stared at each other, mutual frustration hanging in the air. Then George exhaled deeply. "Fine. Show me how you want me to walk." Amber hesitated, then stepped closer. "It's about presence, not pace." She stood beside him. "You need to occupy the space, not just cross it. Look ahead, but stay aware of the environment, the sounds, the light, the people watching." She began to walk, slowly, each step measured but fluid as if she were gliding. George watched, fascinated despite himself. There was something hypnotic about the way she moved. It wasn't just technique, it was intent. Every gesture had purpose, weight, meaning. Now. You, Amber said, returning to the starting point. George tried to imitate her. It was better, but still missing something. Relax your shoulders, she instructed, stepping closer. You're tense. And then, before either of them thought twice, Amber placed her hands on his shoulders, pressing gently. George froze. It wasn't the touch itself. It was professional, technical, nothing more than a posture correction. But it was the first time she had deliberately touched him, and something about that simple contact reverberated in a way neither of them expected. He felt the warmth of her hands through the fabric of his shirt, caught the faint scent of her perfume, jasmine, he was sure now, and realized he was holding his breath for no reason at all. Amber noticed it too. Her hands lingered on his shoulders a second longer than necessary, and when she pulled them away, it was too quickly, like she had touched something hot. Better, she said, her voice one note lower than usual. Now try again. George walked, and this time it worked. He didn't know if it was because his shoulders were relaxed or because he was hyper-aware of every movement, trying not to think about the fact that he could still feel where her hands had been. Perfect, Amber said, and there was something strange in her voice too. They rehearsed the vows next, words carefully written by Lorenzo to sound meaningful without being personal, poetic without being romantic. George read his part with the precision of someone reciting a financial report. Amber read hers with the controlled emotion of a performer with years of stage experience. You sound like you're reading a grocery list, said Evelyn, appearing from the wings like an elegant ghost. Amber's old mentor had returned to the theater a few weeks earlier to oversee the artistic aspects of the reopening, and since then, she had made a habit of showing up at the most inconvenient moments with sharp, unnervingly accurate observations. We're rehearsing, Amber replied, defensive. You're reciting, Evelyn corrected, walking onto the stage with the posture of someone who had spent a lifetime there. There's a difference. You have to believe what you're saying, even if it's fiction. How do you believe in something that's a lie by definition? George asked, genuinely curious. Evelyn smiled, that enigmatic smile that always suggested she knew far more than she let on. Every good lie has a core of truth. Find the truth in what you're saying, and the rest flows naturally. She looked between them. Do you two respect this theater? Yes, they both answered without hesitation. Do you believe it deserves to survive? Yes. Then say that. Not the words on the page. Say what you truly feel about this place. Improvise. Amber and George exchanged uncertain looks. Now, Amber asked. Now, Evelyn confirmed, settling comfortably into a seat in the front row. Pretend you're alone. No audience, no cameras, no magazine, just the two of you. And the truth. The silence that followed was thick. George spoke first, hands in his pockets, eyes fixed on some distant point in the theater. When I bought this place, I only saw structure, square footage, profit potential, strategic location. He paused. But after spending months here, watching people work, watching you, he glanced briefly at Amber. Seeing what this space means, I started to understand that some places aren't just property, they're living memory. And maybe, just maybe, preserving that is as important as any financial return. Amber stood frozen, surprised. Those were not the words she expected from him, not with that raw, almost reluctant sincerity. Then it was her turn. I've always known this theater was special, but over the past few months I've realized preservation isn't just about protecting the past. It's about ensuring there's a future. She looked at George. And maybe I do need someone pragmatic, infuriatingly efficient, and obsessed with schedules to make sure what I love doesn't crumble under the weight of its own history. Their eyes met, and for a long moment, neither of them looked away. Something unspoken passed between them, a recognition, a mutual admission that maybe, just maybe, they needed each other more than either was willing to admit. Evelyn clapped softly, breaking the spell. That, exactly that. Use those words on the day, not the script. That. She stood and left, once again leaving them alone. George cleared his throat, visibly uncomfortable with what he had just revealed. Was that too intense? No, Amber said, her voice strangely gentle. It was honest, and I prefer honest. Even when honest means admitting you were right about some things. She smiled, especially when it means that. The following days were a strange mix of frantic routine and stolen moments. The theater was always full. Crews working, Lorenzo's team documenting, sponsors visiting. But somehow George and Amber always found small intervals to rehearse, to adjust details, to debate decisions. And those debates had changed in tone. It wasn't that they agreed on everything, far from it, but the hostility had given way to something more layered, affectionate provocation, reluctant respect, growing curiosity. "Did you know you smile when you're focused?" Amber remarked one afternoon while they were reviewing the guest list. George looked up, puzzled. "I don't smile." "You do. It's a small smile, barely noticeable, but it's there." She pointed to the corner of his mouth. "Right there. When you think you've solved something complicated." George touched his own face as if he could feel the smile he didn't know he made. "And you," he countered. "Wrinkle your nose when you disagree with something, even before you say it." "I don't wrinkle my nose." "You do." He mimicked the gesture, exaggerating on purpose. Amber threw a cushion at him, laughing. George caught it midair, surprised by his own reflexes, and then laughed too. A genuine, rare sound that made Amber pause and look at him as if she were seeing someone entirely new. "You should laugh more often," she said without thinking. "You should throw fewer cushions," he replied, but he was still smiling. Brandon, who had walked in unnoticed, watched the scene with a satisfied expression. "You two realize you're flirting, right?" "We are not," they said in unison, far too defensively to be convincing. Brandon just shook his head, amused, and dropped off the papers he'd brought. "Of course not. Carry on." One night, less than a week before the event, George stayed late at the theater, checking the final technical details. It was past midnight when he heard music again. He knew the pattern by now. Amber rehearsing. Alone after everyone had gone home. He had started to expect it, though he'd never admit that out loud. There was something mesmerizing about watching her dance, something beyond the precision or beauty of her movements. It was the total surrender, the vulnerability she never allowed herself in daylight. This time, however, he didn't stay hidden at the doorway. He walked down to the stage and sat in the front row, waiting for her to notice. Amber finished the sequence and finally saw George sitting there watching. She didn't look surprised or irritated, just curious. "How long have you been there?" she asked, grabbing a towel. "Long enough," he replied, echoing the same words he'd said months earlier, the first time he saw her dance. But this time the tone was different. There was no distance. There was something closer to admiration. Amber stepped down from the stage and sat in the seat beside him, still breathing heavily, her heartbeat racing from the exertion. "Why do you stay?" she asked. George took his time to answer, as if searching for the right words. "Because when you dance, I understand." "Understand what?" "Why you fight so hard. Why this place matters. Why art isn't a luxury. It's a necessity." He turned to her. "I never understood that before, but now I do." Amber felt something tighten in her chest. It wasn't discomfort. It was something warmer, scarier. "That was almost poetic," she said, trying to keep her tone light. "Careful, or I might start believing you have a heart." "I've always had one," he said quietly. "I was just too busy to pay attention to it." They sat there side by side in the empty theater, the silence between them no longer heavy with hostility but filled with something new and unnamed, something neither of them was ready to define. "George," Amber said, breaking the silence, "what happens after?" "After what?" "After the event, after the ceremony, after the lights go out and everyone leaves. What happens to this?" She gestured vaguely between them. George was quiet for a long time. "I don't know," he finally admitted, for the first time in a long while. "I really don't know." And there was something freeing in that confession. Something terrifying, too. Amber nodded as if that answer were enough. Maybe it was. They stayed there until almost 2 in the morning, talking about things that had nothing to do with the theater. Childhood memories, silly fears, old dreams, small regrets. And when they finally stood to leave, there was a new kind of intimacy between them. An intimacy that hadn't been rehearsed, and that somehow felt like the most real thing they had shared so far. The next day, Lorenzo showed up with news. "The press is going insane," he said, grinning far too widely. "Everyone wants to cover the event. We'll have 3 TV networks, 2 international news agencies, and more than 50 accredited journalists." 50? Amber repeated, incredulous. "You two have become a phenomenon." Lorenzo said, opening his tablet to show the headlines. The Impossible Wedding. When Enemies Become Allies. The Union That Saved the Ashford. People are obsessed. George looked at the headlines, his expression unreadable. They know it's symbolic, right? They do, Lorenzo confirmed. But it doesn't matter. The story's too good. You two are living proof that differences can be overcome. That love, he paused dramatically, or whatever it is you two have can grow from the most unlikely conflicts. We don't have anything, Amber said far too quickly. Of course not. Lorenzo grinned, clearly not believing a word, which is why you can't seem to stop looking at each other when you think no one's watching. He left before they could argue. George and Amber were left alone, the silence between them now thick with a new, uneasy awareness. He's delusional, George said. Completely, Amber agreed. But neither of them could look the other in the eye when they said it, because deep down, they both knew Lorenzo wasn't entirely wrong. And that was the most terrifying thing of all. The morning of the event dawned under a clear, cold sky, the kind that wrapped Chicago in golden light and razor-sharp air. The theater was unrecognizable, not in structure, which had been faithfully restored, but in energy. Flowers filled every corner, lights were strategically placed, security was discreet yet constant, and a steady stream of important people arrived in cars that cost more than most houses. Amber sat in the main dressing room, surrounded by Lillian, Anise, and the hair and makeup team Lorenzo had insisted on hiring. She wore a dress that wasn't exactly bridal, but flirted dangerously with the idea. Ivory silk, elegantly modern cut, no veil or frills, but with a soft train that flowed like water across the floor. Her hair was styled in a low, sophisticated bun, a few loose strands framing her face. She looked beautiful in a way that almost hurt. Classic, timeless, real. You look like a princess from one of those European indie films, Anise said, adjusting the hem of the dress. The kind that wins awards in Cannes and makes everyone cry. Or the kind that ends tragically, Amber murmured, staring at her reflection with a mix of admiration and unease. It's not going to end tragically, Lillian said, checking her phone schedule for what must have been the 1,000th time. It's going to end with you giving a flawless performance, winning sponsors, and securing the theater's future. That's it. Nothing more. But her tone didn't sound nearly as certain as her words. Amber took a deep breath, trying to steady the heart that was beating too fast. It wasn't stage nerves that she knew how to control. This was something else. A different kind. Anxiety, more personal, more frightening. I don't know if I can do this, she admitted quietly. Lillian sat beside her and took her hand. Do what? The ceremony? You've rehearsed it 1,000 times. No. Amber looked at her friend. Pretend that I don't feel anything. The silence that followed was heavy. Anise stopped fussing with the dress. Lillian squeezed Amber's hand tighter. Amber, Lillian began softly. What are you feeling? I don't know, she answered, honestly. I just know that when I'm near him, everything feels different, more intense, more complicated. And I don't know if that's a good thing or just the stress making us confuse partnership with something else. Or maybe, Anise said with her trademark bluntness, you're in love and too scared to admit it. I'm not in love, Amber said too quickly. Being in love it's something else. It's more. I respect him. I admire his intelligence. I like how he challenges me. And when he smiles, that rare smile he barely ever shows, She stopped, realizing what she was saying. Lillian and Anise exchanged significant glances. Sis, Anise said as gently as she could manage, you just described love. Amber closed her eyes. I'm doomed, aren't I? Completely, Lillian agreed, but she was smiling, though maybe the good kind of doomed. Across the theater, in what had once been the director's office, now turned into a makeshift dressing room for George. The atmosphere was just as tense, though quieter and lonelier. George adjusted his tie for the 5th time, his hands not entirely steady. He was wearing a tuxedo, Lorenzo had insisted, and for once George hadn't argued. The cut was perfect, tailor-made, the kind of suit he wore to galas and corporate events. But this time it felt different. This time it felt significant. Brandon leaned against the wall, watching him with an expression somewhere between Amusement and concern. "You're nervous," he observed. "I'm not," George said, abandoning the tie, which was already perfectly straight, and moving on to his shirt cuffs. "You are. I've known you 20 years. You only mess with your cuffs when you're nervous." George stopped, realizing Brandon was right. "It's just an event, a performance. It doesn't mean anything." "Keep saying that," Brandon said, pushing off the wall. "Maybe one day you'll believe it." George turned to face him. "What do you want me to say?" "I want you to be honest. With me. And with yourself." Brandon crossed his arms. "You have feelings for her." It wasn't a question. George stayed silent for a long moment, staring out the window at the stage where, in less than an hour, he would have to fake a wedding with a woman who had gone from irritating adversary to, what? He didn't even know what to call it. "I admire her," he said finally. "I respect her dedication, her passion, the way she fights for what she believes in. I like how she's not afraid to challenge me, to tell me when I'm wrong, to make me see things differently. And, when she walks into a room, I notice. When she smiles, I want to know why. When she dances, I forget the rest of the world exists." He paused, his voice dropping. "And the thought of finishing this project and never seeing her again bothers me in a way I wasn't prepared to feel." Brandon nodded, as if that confirmed everything he already knew. "You're in love." "I don't know what I am," George admitted, running a hand through his hair. A rare, awkward gesture. "I just know this wasn't part of the plan. None of it was." "The best things never are," Brandon said, placing a hand on his friend's shoulder. "And you've got two choices. Either pretend you don't feel a thing and let her walk away when this is over, or do something about it. And what if she doesn't feel the same? And what if she does?" George's silence was answer enough. A knock on the door. A production assistant announcing there were 30 minutes left. Brandon patted his shoulder. "Showtime. Try not to faint at the altar." "It's not a real altar," George muttered. "Then why are you treating it like one?" He left before George could answer. George stood there alone, adjusting his tux one last time, taking a deep breath, trying to regain the composure that had once been his defining trait. But control had started slipping through the cracks months ago. The moment a stubborn ballerina walked down a staircase and declared war. And now, he wasn't sure he wanted it back. The theater was packed, all 450 seats taken, with more people standing along the aisles in the back. Cameras, journalists, important investors, cultural figures, local politicians, every eye turned toward the stage. The lighting was perfect. Anise had done a masterful job. The acoustics were flawless. The restored stage gleamed, waiting. Lorenzo stood backstage, glowing, orchestrating the final details like a maestro before a symphony. 15 minutes, he announced. George enters from the right, Amber from the left. Meet in the center, say the vows you rehearsed, unveil the plaque together. Applause, done. Simple, elegant, perfect, but nothing about it felt simple. Amber waited in the left wing, breathing in steady counts the way she did before every performance. Her hands trembled slightly. She clenched them into fists, forcing herself to calm down. On the other side of the stage, George waited, hands in his pockets, expression composed. But his heartbeat was a wild, uneven drum he couldn't quiet. The music began. Instrumental, refined, not quite a wedding march, but close enough to set the mood. The lights dimmed, leaving only the stage bathed in gold. "It's time," Lorenzo whispered to Amber. She took one step forward, then another, and suddenly she was on stage, walking beneath the spotlights, 450 pairs of eyes on her. But she saw only one. George entered from the opposite side, walking with the rhythm Amber had taught him. Not too fast, not mechanical, but present. And he too had eyes for only one person. They met in the center of the stage, and the whole world disappeared. There was no script in Amber's head, no strategy in George's mind, only the two of them, standing inches apart, looking into each other's eyes under a light that felt otherworldly. "Hi," Amber said softly, barely audible to the audience, but George heard. "Hi," he replied, a small smile tugging at his lips. The host, a local actor Lorenzo had hired, began talking about the history of the Ashford, about the importance of cultural preservation, about the unlikely partnership that had saved the theater. but neither George nor Amber was really listening. "You look beautiful," George murmured, low enough for her alone. Amber's heart skipped. "You too," she said, then realized what she'd said. "I mean, handsome. You look handsome, not beautiful. Men aren't." Anyway, he smiled, a real, full smile, the kind she had seen so few times. "Got it." The host was calling them to their vows. George took Amber's hand, not part of the script, but it felt natural. She intertwined her fingers with his, and a current of electricity ran through them both. George began improvising, just as Evelyn had suggested. "When I first walked into this theater, all I saw were walls and financial potential. But you taught me to see history, memory, soul. You taught me that preserving the past isn't resisting the future, it's giving it a foundation." He squeezed her hand, eyes locked on hers. "And you taught me that sometimes the best partnerships begin with the worst first impressions." The audience murmured, moved, but Amber barely heard them. Then, it was her turn. "I've spent my whole life protecting what I love, fighting anyone who tried to change it. And then you showed up, with your plans and your spreadsheets, and I thought you were the enemy." She smiled, small and vulnerable. "But you taught me that change isn't destruction, that renewal isn't forgetting, and that sometimes the person you dislike the most is exactly the one you need." George felt something tighten in his chest. It wasn't discomfort. It was something far stronger, something unstoppable. The host was saying something about symbolic unity, about raising the curtain together. But neither of them moved. They just stood there, hands intertwined, eyes locked. And for the first time since they'd met, there was no pretending. It was real. Everything was real. The audience waited. Cameras rolled. Backstage, Lorenzo waved his arms wildly, urging them to unveil the plaque. But George and Amber stayed frozen, caught in a moment neither of them knew how to end. It was George who finally broke the silence, his voice low, meant only for her. "If I kiss you now, it won't be for the performance." Amber's heart stopped, restarted, then stumbled, uneven. "I know," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Then let's be clear." He took a step closer, the hand holding hers tightening slightly. "This might not be a real wedding, but what I feel is." Amber felt tears burn behind her eyes. Something rare, almost impossible for someone who'd learned to control every emotion on stage. "George, She never finished, because at that moment the carefully built structure of control and restraint crumbled. George pulled her close and kissed her. It wasn't a staged kiss. It wasn't a performance. It was real, deep, desperate, inevitable. It was months of tension dissolving in one single moment. It was every argument, every provocation, every stolen glance finally finding its meaning. Amber kissed him back, her hands rising to his face, pulling him closer, forgetting there were 450 people watching, forgetting the cameras, forgetting everything except the feeling of finally, stopping the fight against what she'd been feeling all along. The audience erupted in applause. Only then did they break apart, both breathless, both dazed, both aware of what they had just done. "That wasn't in the script," Amber murmured, her lips still inches from his. "I know," George said, his forehead resting against hers. "But it should have been." The rest of the event passed in a blur. They unveiled the plaque, smiled for the cameras, shook hands with sponsors, gave interviews, but none of it mattered. The only real thing had been that kiss. When they finally found a moment alone, it was late. The theater was empty, the lights turned off, only the emergency lamps casting long shadows across the lobby. Amber sat on the staircase, still in her dress, shoes abandoned beside her. George sat down next to her, his tie undone, tuxedo jacket slung over one shoulder. "So," she said, not looking at him. "About the kiss." "About the kiss," he echoed. It was real. It was. "And now?" George was silent, thinking. He was a man of plans, of strategies, of always being 5 steps ahead. But at that moment, for the first time in years, he had no plan at all. "Now," he said finally, "I think we need to talk. For real. No audience, no cameras, no pretending." Amber finally looked at him. "About what we feel. About everything." She nodded, and there was fear in her eyes. Fear, but also hope. "I'm scared." she admitted softly. Me too, George said. But for the first time, fear doesn't make me want to run. Amber smiled. Small, fragile. When did you become so brave? When I met someone worth the risk. Then he took her hand, their fingers intertwining, and they sat there together on the theater staircase that had brought them together, while outside the city moved on, indifferent, and inside the future waited to be decided. But not everything was settled. Because the next morning, when Amber woke to dozens of missed calls and messages, when she opened social media and saw the headlines, when she realized the kiss had gone viral and the entire world was speculating about their relationship, reality hit hard, and with reality came the doubts. Calls from journalists asking for exclusive interviews, sponsors eager to capitalize on the love story, Lorenzo calling non-stop about brand collaborations and press opportunities, and Amber, sitting on the edge of her bed, staring at a phone that wouldn't stop ringing, realized something terrifying. She no longer knew what was real and what was performance, and she wasn't sure George did either. Amber spent the 3 days following the event avoiding George. It wasn't difficult. He seemed to be avoiding her, too. His messages were short, strictly professional, about final details of the theater that still needed to be handled. Nothing about the kiss, nothing about what had been said, nothing about what any of it meant. The silence between them was deafening. The problem was the rest of the world wasn't silent. Social media had exploded. The video of the kiss had been watched millions of times. Culture bloggers, gossip magazines, even serious news outlets were covering the story. The wedding that wasn't a wedding but felt like one. When enemies fall in love in real time. The love story that saved a historic theater. Lorenzo was over the moon, milking every second of attention. The sponsors were more interested than ever. Documentary proposals, exclusive interviews, even rumors of a TV adaptation arrived daily. But Amber felt suffocated. She was sitting in her apartment, trying to rehearse a new choreography, but her body refused to cooperate. Her mind was elsewhere, on the kiss, on George's words, on the way he had looked at her like she was the only person in the universe, and on how he had vanished afterward. You need to talk to him, said Lillian, for the 10th time in 3 days, sitting on the couch with a cup of tea that had long gone cold. There's nothing to talk about, Amber replied, stretching her leg at the bar with more force than necessary. It was a moment. Intense, yes. Real, maybe. But still just a moment. A moment that went viral and that the whole planet is talking about. Exactly. Which is why it means nothing. Amber let go of the bar and turned to face her friend. How do I even know it was real and not just adrenaline? Stage euphoria? Some mix-up between character and person? Because you didn't kiss a character, Lillian said, setting her cup down, her voice firming. You kissed George, and he kissed you back, and you both looked terrified and happy at the same time. Saw it, Amber. Everyone saw it. Everyone saw what they wanted to see. Amber sat on the floor, hugging her knees. A nice story. A modern fairy tale. But what if that's all it is? A story that looks beautiful from a distance but up close is just a mess. Love is a mess, Lillian said gently. Always has been, but that doesn't make it any less real. Amber closed her eyes, her voice small and vulnerable. What if he doesn't feel the same way? What if to him it was just a moment too? There's only one way to find out, Lillian said, grabbing her bag. You ask, and you stop being a coward. She left, and Amber was alone with her thoughts, and a fear she didn't know how to face. Across town, George was having a very similar conversation, the male version, with Brandon. They were at the office, but George hadn't done much work. He kept staring at his phone, typing messages to Amber and deleting them before sending. A dozen attempts, none delivered. You're pathetic, Brandon observed, flipping through the reports George was supposed to be reviewing. And I say that as someone who's been pathetic enough to recognize it when I see it. I'm not pathetic. I'm processing. You're scared, Brandon corrected. Scared that it was real. Scared she doesn't feel the same. Scared you'll ruin everything if you admit what you feel. George didn't answer, which was answer enough. Brandon sighed and closed the folder. Look, I'll be blunt because someone has to be. You've spent 43 years building walls, control, logic, emotional distance, Great for business, terrible for everything else. Then this woman shows up, tears down every wall in a matter of months, makes you feel things you didn't even know you could feel, and you're sitting here, processing. I don't know how to do this, George admitted, his voice uncharacteristically uncertain. Relationships, feelings, vulnerability. I'm good at closing. Deals, not at this. Nobody's good at this at first, Brandon said, sitting across from him. You think I was good when I met my ex-wife? I was a disaster, but I tried, and even though it didn't last, I don't regret trying. What if I try and ruin everything? What if you don't try and spend the rest of your life wondering what if? George stayed quiet, his fingers tapping on the desk, the gesture that betrayed his nerves. She hasn't answered my messages, he said finally. I sent 3, strictly about the theater, nothing personal, but she replied with one-word answers. She's avoiding me, or she's just as scared as you are. Why would she be scared? Brandon laughed, incredulous. George, you kissed her in front of 400 people and millions of viewers online. You told her it was real, and then you disappeared for 3 days. If I were her, I'd be confused too. George ran a hand down his face, exhausted. I screwed everything up, didn't? Not yet, Brandon said, standing. But you will if you keep hiding here instead of going to her and telling her how you feel. For real. No performance, no audience, no excuses. And if she says she doesn't want me, then at least you'll know, and you can move on. Brandon paused at the door. But something tells me she won't say that. That night Amber was alone in the theater. She had gone there because she needed the emptiness of the space, the familiarity of the stage, the kind of silence only a closed theater could offer. She danced without music, guided only by the sound of her own footsteps against the wooden floor, trying to find clarity in the one language she had always trusted most, movement. But clarity wouldn't come, only confusion. She stopped at the center of the stage, breathing deeply, when she heard the door open. George stood in the entrance, still in his suit from the office, his gaze locked on her with an intensity that made her heart stumble. I tried to give you space, he said, his voice echoing through the empty theater. I thought you needed time to process. That we did, but I can't take it anymore. Amber stepped down from the stage slowly, each movement measured, trying to steady her breathing. Can't take what exactly? Pretending that kiss didn't change everything. He took a few steps toward her, his hands tucked into his pockets like he needed them to stay busy. Pretending I don't think about you all the time. That I don't wake up wanting to know if you slept well. That I don't spend every day looking for any excuse to see you. Amber stopped a few feet away, her heart pounding so hard she was sure he could hear it. George, let me finish, he said, his voice firm but vulnerable. Because if I stop now, I might not have the courage to start again. She nodded silently. George took a deep breath. I've spent my entire life avoiding emotional complications. Relationships always seemed inefficient, too risky. I preferred control, predictability, clear agreements. And then you appeared, stubborn, passionate, impossible, and destroyed every defense system I had. He took another step closer. You drive me crazy. You make me question every decision I make. But you also make me want to be better, more present, more human. And when I watch you dance, when you smile, that rare smile that only appears when you think no one's watching, when you argue with me because you actually care about something, I realize that. He paused, searching for the right words. I realize I might have spent 43 years waiting for someone who could make me feel that living means more than just existing efficiently. The silence that followed was thick with everything left unsaid. Amber felt tears burn behind her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. Not yet. And the kiss? She asked softly. Was it real, or was it just the moment? George closed the last bit of distance between them, standing so close she had to tilt her head to meet his eyes. It was the most real thing I've ever done, he said, his gaze steady on hers. And I'm terrified because I don't know how to do this right. I don't know how to be the man you deserve, but I want to try, if you'll let me. A tear finally escaped, sliding down Amber's cheek. I'm scared too, she admitted, her voice trembling. Scared that this is too intense, too fast. Scared we'll hurt each other. Scared that when the adrenaline fades, we'll realize it wasn't just, George interrupted gently. his hands rising to cradle her face with a tenderness that contrasted the steadiness he was known for. "I know the difference between adrenaline and love, Amber, and what I feel for you isn't adrenaline." Amber's heart stopped. "Love?" she repeated, her voice barely a whisper. "Love," he confirmed without hesitation. "Complicated, inconvenient, completely illogical, but real. More real than any spreadsheet or strategy I've ever made." Amber let the tears fall now, freely, because there was no reason left to hold them back. "I thought you didn't believe in love," she said, half laughing, half crying. "I didn't," he said, brushing away her tears with his thumb. "Not until you proved me wrong. About everything." And then it was Amber who closed the distance. She kissed him with everything she had. All the confusion, the fear, the hope, the passion she'd carried for months. She kissed him like it was both the first and the last time, like it was the only way to say everything words never could. George kissed her back, his arms wrapping around her, pulling her closer as if to make sure she was real, that this was real. And for the first time in months, maybe years, he didn't think about control or logic or consequences. He just felt. When they finally broke apart, both, breathless, George rested his forehead against hers. "So, we try?" he asked. "For real? No performance, no audience, no pretending?" Amber smiled, that rare, genuine smile he had learned to love. "We try," she agreed. "But fair warning, I'm complicated. Stubborn. I have opinions about everything and I don't lose arguments easily." "I know," he said, smiling back. "That's exactly why it works." The news that their relationship was real leaked inevitably. Lorenzo, of course, couldn't keep the secret for long. But this time, George and Amber didn't care. They gave a joint interview, honest and straightforward, explaining that yes, what had begun as a professional partnership had turned into something more. Yes, they had been as surprised as everyone else. And no, they didn't have all the answers, but they were willing to find them together. The reaction was mixed. Some fans loved it, others called it a publicity stunt. But George and Amber had learned something important. The world's opinion mattered less than the truth between them. A week later, they were back at the theater, this time without cameras or teams, just the two of them, reviewing the final details of the upcoming season. "The ballet season is almost sold out," Amber said, scrolling through her tablet, "and we have 3 international companies requesting the space." "Good return on investment," George replied, though his tone carried amusement. "You were right. Preservation worked better than demolition. And you were right about modernizing management," she admitted. "Without your infernal spreadsheets, we'd be bankrupt already." They looked at each other and smiled. "Look at us," George said. "Agreeing, that's getting worrisome." "Don't get used to it," Amber said, closing the tablet. "I still plan to fight you about that coffee shop you want to open in the basement." "It's not a coffee shop. It's a cultural lounge." "Same thing." "It's not." They started bickering again. But now their arguments came with smiles, intertwined hands, and kisses stolen between debates. That night, after they finished working, they stayed on the empty stage, the lights off except for a single spotlight shining at the center. "Dance for me," George said from the first row. Amber raised an eyebrow. "You know I charge a lot for private performances." "I can pay," he said, grinning. "Or I can offer alternative payment methods." She laughed, climbing back onto the stage. "You're getting bold. You taught me well." Amber danced. Not a formal choreography, just free, expressive, honest movement. And George watched, completely mesmerized, realizing he would never get tired of that sight. When she finished and came to sit beside him, he took her hand. "I love you," he said, because now he could say it without fear. For the record, officially. Amber turned to him, eyes shining. "Officially?" she asked, teasing. "I want it on the record, in writing. No ambiguity." "You're impossible," she said, smiling. "And you love me anyway," he said, confident now. "Yes," she answered without hesitation. "I love you." In a completely illogical, inconvenient way. "The best kind of love," he said, pulling her close and kissing her slowly, savoring the certainty that this was real. Theirs, unscripted. 2 weeks later, Brandon and Lillian, who had become unlikely friends through the whole process, were having coffee at a bistro near the theater. "They're going to get married for real, you know," Lillian said, stirring sugar into her cup. I know, Brandon agreed. I'm betting within a year. 6 months, Lillian countered. George is methodical, but once he decides something, he doesn't stall. And Amber's a secret romantic. She'll want the perfect ceremony, which will take 6 months to plan. Lillian smiled. What are we? Betting? Dinner. At the best restaurant in town. Deal. They clinked coffee cups, both secretly rooting for their friends to be happy, no matter when they decided to make official what everyone already knew. 3 months later, on an ordinary weeknight, George and Amber were at his apartment, which had naturally become theirs over time, with Amber's clothes taking up half the closet and ballet slippers scattered across the living room. They were on the couch, she with her head, resting in his lap, reading scripts for upcoming shows, he answering emails on his laptop. Comfortable silence, easy presence. Amber, George said suddenly, closing the laptop. She looked up. Marry me. She blinked, sitting up. What? Marry me, he repeated, firmer this time. For real this time. Not symbolic, not staged, real, legal, forever. Amber was speechless for a few seconds, her heart racing. You're proposing like this? No ring? No kneeling? Nothing? I have a ring, he said, pulling a small box from his pocket. And I can kneel if you want. But I didn't want to wait for the perfect moment because I realized every moment with you already is. He opened the box, revealing a ring that was simple, elegant, timeless, exactly her style. I love you in a completely illogical way, he continued, echoing her words. You're complicated, stubborn, impossible, and I don't want to spend a single day of my life without you challenging me, annoying me, and reminding me that living is worth more than merely existing. Tears streamed down Amber's face now, but she was smiling. That was almost poetic. You taught me, he smiled back. So, will you marry me? For real this time? Amber pretended to think, but she couldn't keep the act for more than 2 seconds. Yes, she said, throwing her arms around his neck. Yes, 1,000 times, yes. George slipped the ring onto her finger. Perfect. As if it had always belonged there. Then he kissed her, pouring into that kiss every ounce of love, certainty, and promise of the future he could hold. When they finally pulled apart, Amber looked down at the ring, then back at him. You know everyone's gonna say we got married too fast. Let them talk, George said, pulling her back into his arms on the couch. They don't know I already knew I'd marry you the day you came down those stairs calling me a vandal of the arts. Amber laughed. Liar, you hated me. I thought I did, he corrected, but it was just fear in disguise, fear of what you made me feel. And now? Now I'm not afraid of anything, as long as it's with you. They stayed there, tangled together, planning a future neither of them had foreseen, but both now wanted with absolute certainty. The wedding took place 6 months later. Lillian won the bet, in an intimate ceremony held at the theater itself. Only close family and friends. No press, no performance. Just love, genuine and simple. Amber wore a gown even more beautiful than the one from the symbolic ceremony, and George waited for her on the same stage where they had married for the first time. But now, when she walked toward him, when they exchanged vows they had written together, when he kissed her under the emotional applause of their guests, there was no doubt. It was real. It had been real all along. And when they danced their first waltz, George had taken secret lessons to surprise her and almost managed to keep up. Amber whispered in his ear, Good thing you bought my theater. Our theater, he corrected with a smile. And good thing you came down those stairs ready for war. Best war I've ever fought. And the last one, he said, spinning her before pulling her close again. Because now we're on the same team. Forever, she agreed, sealing the promise with a kiss that had nothing of performance and everything of forever. Ashford Hall thrived. It became a cultural landmark, home to international companies, a stage for historic moments. And in the lobby, beside the commemorative plaque of the reopening, there hung a framed photograph, George and Amber on the day of the symbolic ceremony, seconds before the kiss that changed everything. Below it, a small inscription read, When numbers met art, when logic met passion, when two impossibles became inevitable. And everyone who passed by knew. Some love stories are born in the most unlikely places, and those are exactly the ones that last forever. 3 years after the wedding, morning light streamed through the bedroom window. that soft golden glow typical of late spring mornings, painting patterns across the wooden floor and illuminating the organized chaos the space had become, a perfect blend of George and Amber. Business books stacked beside biographies of legendary dancers, a sleek desk covered in papers, financial reports on one side, sheet music for a new performance on the other, ballet slippers hanging from a chair, ties perfectly aligned in the open closet. Amber woke first, as always. A dancer's body came with an unforgiving internal clock, but instead of immediately stretching, she stayed there, watching George still asleep beside her. 3 years of marriage, and she was still surprised by the small details, the way he furrowed his brow even in sleep, as if solving problems in his dreams, how his hair stuck up in a way he'd hate if he saw it, and how, even unconscious, his hand reached instinctively for hers under the sheets. She smiled, lacing her fingers through his. George opened his eyes slowly, that gradual awakening he had learned after giving up the 5:45 a.m. alarm. Amber had convinced him, after months of argument and a few strategic coffee strikes, that waking at 7 was equally productive and infinitely healthier. "You're watching me sleep." "Again," he murmured, his voice rough with sleep, still mildly unsettling. "I was appreciating the rare sight of George Williams, vulnerable and messy-haired," she said, running her hand through his hair. "It's a piece of contemporary art. Ephemeral. Deserves to be documented." "Ephemeral," he mumbled, pulling her closer and burying his face against her neck. "You and your ballerina words. You love my ballerina words." "I do," he said without hesitation, pressing a kiss to her shoulder. "Just as much as I love your infuriating perfectionism, your impossible stubbornness, and the way you reorganize my files every time you decide my system doesn't make sense. Your system didn't make sense. Now it does, because you imposed yours." "Exactly. I'm civilizing you, little by little." George laughed, that sound that had become so familiar over the years, and that Amber never grew tired of hearing. "And you think you're winning this war? Darling." She turned to face him, eyes sparkling with that affectionate provocation that had become their shared language. "I already have. You just haven't realized it yet." He was about to reply when Amber's phone alarm went off, her reminder for the morning rehearsal she had scheduled at the theater. "Time to move, Mr. Executive," she said, giving him a quick kiss before jumping out of bed with the energy of someone who might be 39 but still moved like 20. "Meeting at 9. Remember?" "How could I forget?" George sat up, stretching. "You only reminded me 20 times yesterday, and I'll remind you 20 more today. It's my duty as wife and partner." Partner. That had been the biggest change over the past 2 years. After the spectacular success of the reopening and the sponsorship contracts that secured the theater's future, Amber and George made official what had long been reality. She had become a minority partner of the theater, not just a resident artist, but co-owner and official artistic director. Their arguments now took place in formal board meetings, still fiery, but productive. They had found a perfect balance. He handled finance and operations. She oversaw programming and artistic direction. And in the areas where their responsibilities overlapped, they argued until they found consensus. It worked, surprisingly well. An hour later, they were at the theater. The place had completely transformed. In addition to the regular ballet performances, it now hosted workshops, lectures, art exhibits, and even a social program, offering free dance classes to underprivileged children. An idea of Amber's that George had supported immediately, discovering that social investment brought emotional returns no spreadsheet could measure. Evelyn was on stage, overseeing a rehearsal for the new resident company. She had officially returned as a permanent consultant and mentor for the young dancers, and her presence gave the theater an artistic credibility that attracted talent from all over the world. "Good morning, lovebirds," she greeted as George and Amber walked in. "Trying not to be obvious again?" "We're not obvious," said Amber, though she was holding George's hand. "Of course not," Evelyn smiled. "And I definitely didn't see you kissing in the hallway 5 minutes ago." George had the decency to look slightly embarrassed. Amber only shrugged. "Perks of being a co-owner. I can kiss whoever I want in my theater." "Our theater," George corrected, still smiling. Anise appeared from backstage, now the official choreographer, with a tablet in hand, and that focused expression that always vanished the second she saw her sister. "Are you two going to watch the rehearsal or just stand there being disgustingly cute?" "We can do both," Amber replied. "Multitasking. Disgusting," Anise muttered, smiling despite herself. "Oh, and Lillian called. She confirmed for dinner tonight, and said Brandon's coming too." The dinner, a monthly tradition the four of them had stumbled into. George, Amber, Brandon, and Lillian, now close friends who loved reminiscing about the chaotic early days of the couple's Cold War. "Perfect," said George, checking his calendar. "I booked a table at the same restaurant where we first had dinner together." Amber looked at him, surprised. "You remembered?" "I remember everything," he said simply. But there was weight in those words, and it was true. George had a photographic memory for details, and ever since he'd allowed his heart to have a say, he'd begun to notice things he used to ignore. Amber's favorite dish, the song she played when she was nervous, the perfume she wore on special days. He had become, surprisingly, an attentive husband, the kind who remembered anniversaries, sent flowers for no reason, and left witty notes stuck to the refrigerator. Amber, in turn, had discovered she enjoyed taking care of him, making sure he ate properly, slept enough, took real vacations, not those weekend getaways where he brought his laptop. After a year and a half of persistence, she had even convinced him to take yoga classes. He hated them, but he went because she asked. They had become the kind of couple that irritated others with how in sync they were, but couldn't help it. That afternoon, George was in a meeting with sponsors when his phone buzzed. A message from Amber. "Need to talk. Important. Come to the dressing room when you're done." He frowned. Amber rarely interrupted meetings, especially with something marked important. Was there a problem with the theater? With a performance? He ended the meeting 15 minutes early, something he would never have done 3 years earlier, and went straight to the dressing room Amber used as her secondary office. She was sitting on the old couch she refused to replace. "It has history, George. You don't replace history." Hands resting in her lap, an odd expression on her face. "What happened?" he asked immediately, his heart picking up speed. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine," she said, though her voice sounded strange. More than fine, actually. George sat beside her, taking her hands. "Then why do you look like that?" Amber took a deep breath. "Because I didn't plan it. It wasn't in the schedule. Not now. But," she extended her hand, revealing something. Small, white, with 2 pink lines. George stared, then stared again, then processed. "You're pregnant," Amber finished, her voice trembling between laughter and tears. "I'm pregnant. 2 months. I found out this morning. Took 3 tests just to be sure. And..." She didn't finish because George pulled her into an embrace so tight she could barely breathe. "Pregnant," he repeated, his voice muffled in her hair. "We're going to have a baby. It's going to mess everything up," Amber said quickly, nervous. "My tour next year, the theater expansion plans, your trip to Europe, everything will..." "None of that matters," George interrupted, pulling back just enough to look into her eyes, his own hands trembling slightly. "None of it matters compared to this." Then he smiled. That wide, genuine, completely unguarded smile Amber had learned to love because it was so rare, so real. "We're going to have a baby," he repeated, as if he needed to hear it, out loud to believe it. "Are you happy?" Amber asked, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. "Truly happy?" "Amber," he said, cupping her face, his thumb brushing away her tears. "I'm terrified, ecstatic, and utterly unprepared. Exactly how I felt when I realized I loved you. And look how that turned out." She laughed through her tears. "You're going to be a neurotic father." "Absolutely," he said without hesitation. "I'll have spreadsheets for feeding schedules, development charts, risk analyses for every playground. I'll be unbearable. And I'll be the perfectionist mother who insists our child has perfect posture by the time they're 3 months old. We're going to be a disaster. A beautiful disaster," she corrected, pulling him in for a kiss. That night over dinner, they told Brandon and Lillian. The reaction was exactly what one would expect. Lillian screamed. Brandon hugged George hard enough to crack ribs. Waiters cast disapproving looks at the noisy table, and a bottle of champagne George had secretly ordered before even leaving the theater was opened. "I always knew you two would have kids," said Lillian, her eyes already glassy. I'm going to be the godmother, right? Because if not, I'll sue. You're an entertainment lawyer, Amber reminded her. Not family law. I'll reinvent myself. For this child, I'll reinvent myself. Brandon raised his glass. A toast to the couple who proved that love can grow out of poorly interpreted real estate contracts. And to this child, added Lillian, who will grow up in the most beautiful theater in Chicago, with the most stubborn parents in the world, and will be absolutely impossible to handle. Perfect, said Amber, smiling. They'll take after us. They toasted, laughed, planned, and joked about how the baby would probably be born with strong opinions on architecture and choreography. Later that night, when they got home, George rested his head on Amber's lap on the couch, his hand on her still flat belly. I never thought this would happen to me, he said quietly. Family, marriage, children, everything I spent my life avoiding. Regret it? Amber asked, running her fingers through his hair. I regret waiting so long, he said, lifting his eyes to her. Wasting time thinking control mattered more than connection. You didn't waste time, she said softly. You were getting ready. For me. For this. We found each other at the right time. Right time, right place, and he agreed. In the theater that brought us together. And where our child will grow up? Amber smiled. First word's going to be stage, I guarantee it. It's going to be spreadsheet, George countered. We'll see who wins that bet. We will, he smiled, kissing her belly. But I already know who the real winners are. Who? Us. Always. 6 months later, when Amber's belly was impossible to hide, and she had officially stepped back from lead performances, though she still taught classes because, pregnant isn't fragile, George. Stop treating me like porcelain. They were at the theater on an ordinary afternoon. George had insisted on putting an extra comfortable armchair in her office, complete with a footrest and orthopedic cushions. Amber had complained, but secretly loved it. She was there, reviewing proposals for the next season, when she felt it. A movement. Small but unmistakable. George, she called, and there was something in her voice that made him drop the call he was on instantly. What is it? Are you okay? Should I call? Come here. She grabbed his hand and placed it on her belly. Wait. They stood in silence, and then it happened again. A kick. Small but definite. George froze, eyes wide. Was that? It was, Amber said, smiling through tears. Our baby. Saying hi. George knelt in front of her, both hands now, on her belly, waiting. When another kick came, he laughed, a pure, unguarded sound of joy. Hi there, little one, he said, his voice thick. I'm your dad, and your mom is the most stubborn, talented, and extraordinary woman in the world, and we're going to love you so much you'll get sick of it. But too bad, because there's no way out. Amber ran her hand through his hair, her heart so full it hurt. 3 years ago, she whispered, if someone had told me I'd be here, pregnant, married to you, co-owner of this theater, I would have laughed in their face. And now I can't imagine it being any other way. George stood, sitting beside her, pulling her into the embrace that had become their default position. You know what I realized? He said. We never really had a honeymoon. We had that weekend in New York, where I worked half the time and you taught an online class. He grimaced. Doesn't count. So what do you suggest? I can't. Travel now. Doctor banned long flights. Then we'll do it later. When the baby's born, when you're recovered, we'll close the theater for a week. You'll close the theater? She raised an eyebrow. Who are you and what have you done with my husband? Your husband learned, he kissed her forehead, that some things matter more than a schedule. Look at you, she teased, emotionally evolving. I have an excellent teacher. They stayed there, in the office that had witnessed so many arguments, so many deals, so many stolen kisses, planning a future that was, as always, a perfect mix of the two. Their baby was born on a crisp autumn day beneath a clear sky. A girl, Clara. The name had taken 2 months of heated debate, 3 stalemates and 1 coin toss that Amber swore George had rigged. She had her father's eyes and her mother's stubbornness, a fact they discovered within the first weeks, along with a remarkably strong sense of opinion, expressed through specific cries that George had cataloged and classified in a document Amber pretended to mock, but secretly consulted often. The first day they brought Clara to the theater, Amber held her in her arms at the center of the stage, George standing beside her. "This place," Amber said softly, speaking more to the sleeping baby than to George, "is where it all began, where your father and I met, fought, fell in love, and built something together. And it's where you'll grow up," George added, brushing a fingertip over their daughter's tiny cheek. "Surrounded by art, music, dance, and spreadsheets. Lots of spreadsheets. She'll have balance." Amber rested her head on his shoulder. "Sensitivity and logic, passion and pragmatism. Just like her parents," he said, wrapping an arm around her waist. "Poor thing," Amber teased. "She doesn't stand a chance." They laughed, the sound echoing softly through the empty theater, and stayed. There, the three of them, an improbable family born from an impossible beginning. 2 years later, Clara took her first steps on the Ashford Hall stage, her tiny hands held by both parents, while Evelyn, Lillian, Brandon, and Anise watched from the audience, snapping pictures and joking that the girl already had better balance than most adults. The theater thrived, the family grew, and George and Amber still argued, now about parenting decisions, whether Clara should start ballet at 3 or 4, or which room should become the playroom. But at the end of each day, after Clara was asleep, after the lights of the theater had dimmed, after the world fell quiet again, they would lie side by side and acknowledge the simple truth that had become the foundation of everything. They had hated each other in the beginning, but that was only because they'd already been falling in love and didn't yet know how to recognize it. And destiny, clever as always, hadn't just scheduled a wedding, it had scheduled a lifetime. On a sunny afternoon, 10 years after their first meeting, George found Amber on stage, teaching 7-year-old Clara the basics of a dance routine. He stood at the doorway, watching, just as he had so many times before. Amber noticed, as she always did. "How long have you been there?" she asked, smiling. "Long enough," he answered. The same reply as always. Clara ran to him. "Daddy, look, I learned a pirouette." "Show me," he said, kneeling, eyes only on her. She spun, clumsy and perfect, and George clapped as if she'd just won Olympic gold. Amber came closer, wrapping her arms around him from behind, her chin resting on his shoulder. "Good thing you bought this theater," she whispered. "Good thing you walked in ready for war," he replied, turning to kiss her quickly. "Best battle I ever fought. And the last," he echoed the words he'd said at their wedding. "Because now we're on the same team. Forever," she agreed. And that was the forever they built. Not without fights, not without challenges, not without moments of doubt, but always together, always home, in the theater where it all began, and in the love that turned two impossibilities into the inevitable. Because sometimes destiny doesn't just set the wedding, it marks the soul. And when that happens, no script can contain it, no audience can judge it, and no ending can ever be anything but happy. Thank you for joining this journey. George and Amber will live forever on the pages of this story, and in the hearts of those who believe that the most unlikely love is always the truest one. If this story moved you, please give it a like. It truly helps our channel grow and reach more people who adore mature, intelligent romances. Subscribe for more stories that will touch your heart, and don't forget to comment below. Tell us what you thought, your favorite moment, and hype this video so more people can discover this beautiful tale. Your engagement is the fuel that keeps this channel alive. Until the next story, and remember, true love is always worth it, even when it begins as a war.